In 1974, a family of 5 drove from Birmingham to Weston-super-Mare for their annual holiday in a Ford Cortina. The 3 children sat in the back seat without seatbelts, the youngest on the eldest's lap for the last hour when she fell asleep. The father smoked throughout the journey with the window slightly open. They stopped at a roadside cafe where the waitress brought a round of teas and took the order on a pad with a pencil stub. Nobody in the car, nobody in the cafe, nobody on the road between Birmingham and Weston-super-Mare thought anything about any of this was unusual, because it was not unusual. It was Tuesday. Number 11 on this list was so completely normal in working-class and middle-class European life throughout the 1970s that the generation who experienced it cannot quite believe, when they think about it now, that it was ever real. Number 6 would today be considered a serious breach of professional ethics, but in 1975 it was simply how things were done by people who trusted each other because they knew each other. And number 1, the thing at the very top of this list, was the operating assumption of virtually every working-class household in Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands throughout the 1970s, and its replacement changed the daily experience of life so completely that the younger generation genuinely cannot conceive of what the previous assumption felt like from the inside. These are 20 things that were completely normal in Europe in the 1970s that would shock people today, practiced in the cars, the homes, the workplaces, the schools, and the high streets of ordinary Europeans during a decade that seems much further away than 50 years. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because the 1970s was not a worse decade than today on every measure, and understanding what was normal then and what is normal now is the most direct route to understanding what we have gained, what we have lost, and what we have simply traded one thing for another without quite noticing the exchange. Let us count them down. Number 20. Children traveling in cars without seatbelts. The compulsory wearing of front seatbelts in Britain was not introduced until 1983, and rear seatbelt compulsion for children did not arrive until 1989. In France, compulsory seatbelt wearing for front passengers arrived in 1979. Throughout the early and mid-1970s, the family car in Britain and across much of continental Europe carried its children in whatever position seemed most comfortable, on the back seat, on the front seat, on a parent's lap, or in the case of estate cars, in the open boot facing backwards, watching the road recede behind the vehicle. The children of the 1970s who survived those journeys have almost all gone on to buckle their own children and grandchildren with the precision of the converted, understanding retrospectively a risk that they lived through without knowing they were living through it. Number 19. Smoking everywhere. In the 1970s, smoking was permitted in offices, factories, restaurants, pubs, cinemas, railway carriages, aircraft, hospital waiting rooms, and the cars of families with young children without any of these being considered antisocial or harmful to others in a way that required regulation. A working-class man in Britain in 1975 who smoked 20 cigarettes per day did so in his workplace, in the pub, on the bus, and at the kitchen table where his family ate their meals. Cigarettes were advertised on television, in magazines, on billboards, outside schools, and at sporting events without restriction. The health evidence against smoking was already accumulating throughout the 1970s, but the social and regulatory response to that evidence was a generation away from the comprehensiveness that now makes the smoking workplace of 1975 seem as remote as the smoking hospital ward of 1955. Number 18. The doctor who came to your house. The home visit, the GP who came to a patient's home when they were too unwell to attend the surgery, was not a luxury or an emergency service in the 1970s. It was an ordinary feature of general practice across Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, performed by a family doctor who typically knew the household he was visiting, who might have delivered some of its children, and who arrived with a black bag that contained the basic instruments and medications needed for the most common presentations. A British GP in the early 1970s in a working-class practice might perform between 2 and 5 home visits per day as a routine part of his workload. The personal relationship between the GP and the household was the foundation of the medical relationship, and its replacement by the impersonal, appointment system and the walk-in center has changed the nature of primary care so completely that patients who remember the home visiting GP describe the experience of the modern health service as a different institution rather than a reformed version of the same one. Number 17. Buying on tick from the corner shop. The informal credit extended by the corner shop to its regular customers, the arrangement by which known and trusted households could take goods today and settle the account on Friday when the wage packet came in, was a normal feature of working-class retail life across Europe throughout the 1970s. The corner shop owner who allowed the Murphys at number 32 to run a small account was participating in the community management of the gap between the week's expenditure and the week's income that all working-class households navigated. The account was settled reliably because the alternative was losing access to the credit, which was the loss of a necessity. When the corner shop closed before the supermarket, this informal credit system disappeared completely, and with it, the social relationship of mutual obligation and personal trust that had underpinned it. Number 16. Children walking to school alone from the age of 7 or 8. Research that has tracked the independent mobility of children over decades consistently shows that in the early 1970s, the majority of British and continental European children aged 7 and above walked to school unaccompanied by an adult, a journey that might be half a mile or a mile in each direction through a neighborhood the child knew by daily experience. The 7-year-old who walked to school alone in 1973 was acquiring spatial orientation, traffic management, the reading of social situations, and the management of time, skills that the equivalent child driven to school by a parent in 2023 has no opportunity to develop in the same way. The change was not driven by an increase in actual danger to children, which the statistics do not support, but by an increase in the perception of danger shaped by media coverage, legal liability, and the general cultural shift toward the management of risk rather than its acceptance as a feature of normal life. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting, because the items described so far are changes that most people would describe as straightforwardly positive. Seatbelts save lives. Smoking bans protect health. But the next entries describe changes that are more ambiguous, where what was lost in the transition from the 1970s norm to the current norm was not only the risk but also something of genuine value, and where the trade-off is more complex than the simple logic of better safety or better health suggests. Number 15. The bank manager who knew your name and your circumstances. The bank manager in a working class or lower middle class branch of any British, French, or German bank in the early 1970s was a human being who had typically been in his branch for several years, who knew many of his customers by face and name and circumstance, and who could exercise genuine professional discretion in deciding whether to extend a modest overdraft to a reliable customer who had struck a temporary difficulty. The discretion was not infallible. It could be arbitrary and class-biased in ways that the automated credit scoring system is not. But it could also be humane, responsive to genuine individual circumstances, and capable of distinguishing between the customer who had temporarily lost their way and the customer who was constitutionally unable to manage credit, a distinction that no algorithm has ever reliably made. Number 14. Hitchhiking as a normal form of transport. Throughout the 1970s, hitchhiking was a normal and widely practiced form of transport for young people across Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Students hitchhiked between university towns and their family homes. Young workers hitchhiked to job interviews. Travelers hitchhiked across Europe with a rolled sleeping bag and a cardboard sign. The practice was not without risk, and incidents of harm to hitchhikers occurred throughout the period. But the scale of the practice meant that for the vast majority of participants, it was simply cheap, practical, and socially normal transport that provided the incidental benefit of meeting strangers from different backgrounds. When the car became sufficiently ubiquitous, and when the culture of stranger danger made stopping for hitchhikers feel unsafe and socially abnormal, hitchhiking disappeared from the European transport landscape within a decade. Number 13. The pub as the community living room. The working men's pub in Britain and its equivalents across continental Europe, the café in France, the Kuiper in Germany, the Krug in the Netherlands, were not merely licensed premises for the sale of alcohol in the 1970s. They were the community living room of the working-class neighborhood, the space in which the social business of the street was conducted, where work was found through conversation, where disputes were managed, and where the man who had been at home all week had access to the company of other adults in a social setting that required neither wealth nor formal invitation. The transition of the British pub from a community institution to a food service business changed the social function of the institution, at least as much as the smoking ban changed its atmosphere. Number 12. Paying for everything in cash. In the early 1970s, the credit card was not yet a normal feature of working class or lower middle class financial life in most of Europe. The working class family paid for its groceries, its clothing, its household goods, its entertainment, and its services entirely in cash, which meant that the spending was visible in a way that the card tap has made invisible. When you handed over a £5 note and received change, you felt the £5 note leaving. When you tapped a card, you felt nothing. The cash economy of the 1970s produced a different relationship with money that we have renamed financial discipline and presented as a personal virtue when it was actually the structural consequence of the payment method. Number 11. The prescription charge that was lower than the cost of seeing a private doctor. The relationship between the National Health Service and the working-class patient in Britain in the early 1970s was different in kind from the relationship that exists today. The GP was typically known to the patient, the prescription charge was nominal, and the expectation that healthcare would be available without financial anxiety was so deeply embedded in working-class culture that its partial erosion through charges, waiting times, and the growth of private alternatives has felt, to the generation who experienced the earlier system, not as a reform, but as a betrayal. Second pattern break. This next one is where the math gets genuinely complicated, because the next entries describe 1970s norms that sit in a different category, not changes that are straightforwardly better or worse, but changes that reflect a fundamental shift in the assumptions about who is responsible for what, whether the individual, the employer, the state, or the community, that has changed the experience of daily life as profoundly as any specific policy or technology. Number 10. The employer who knew your name and your children's names. The relationship between the working-class employee and their employer in the early 1970s was more personal and more durable than the equivalent relationship in the modern economy. A factory worker who had been at the same plant for 15 years was known by name to the foreman, was known in his humanity to at least some of the people who made decisions that affected his working life. This did not make the employment relationship equal, fair, or free from exploitation. It did make it human, and the humanness had consequences for how disputes were managed, how loyalty was understood, and how the worker's sense of himself in relation to his work was constructed. When the derecognition of unions, the casualization of labor, and the platform economy progressively depersonalized the employment relationship, what was lost was the experience of mattering as a specific individual to the institution that depended on your labor. Number 9. The expectation that a job was for life. The working-class man who found a position with a large employer in the early 1970s, in a factory, a utility, a council, or a nationalized industry, understood that position as a long-term relationship that he would maintain until retirement. The expectation of job permanence shaped every other aspect of his household management, the length of the mortgage he could safely take, the decision about whether his wife would return to work after the children, and the savings he needed to maintain against uncertainty. When the economic restructuring of the 1980s eliminated the job for life in most sectors, the household management assumptions that had been built on it became simultaneously unworkable, and the credit card arrived to fill the gap between the wages the new economy provided and the household expectations the old economy had built. Number 8. The school teacher who could discipline with physical means. Corporal punishment in British and many continental European schools was legal throughout the 1970s and was used by a substantial proportion of teachers as a routine disciplinary tool. The school cane in Britain, the ruler or strap in France and Germany were the backstop of a disciplinary culture in which the authority of the teacher was absolute within the classroom. When corporal punishment was abolished in state schools in Britain in 1987 and in independent schools in 1999, the disciplinary culture of the school changed in ways that are still debated 40 years later, with evidence on both sides about whether the change produced better or worse educational outcomes. Number 7. The assumption that a man's wage would support his entire family. Throughout the 1970s, the working-class household was organized on the assumption that the man's wage was the primary and often the only household income designed to be sufficient for a family of 3 or 4, and that the wife's labor contribution, however economically significant, was domestic rather than waged. The equal pay legislation that arrived across Europe through the 1970s and the subsequent large-scale entry of women into the paid workforce changed this assumption permanently. The economic consequence was not simply that women gained financial independence, it was that the housing market, the childcare market, and the consumer goods market recalibrated to a dual income norm, so that the single income that had supported a family in 1975 was insufficient to support the same family in 1995, and the choice that had been available in 1975 had become in many cases a necessity by 2000. Third pattern break. Here is where the story becomes most personal, because the final entries describe not social policies or economic structures, but the lived texture of daily life in the 1970s, the small normalities of behavior and assumption that made Tuesday in 1974 feel like a specific kind of Tuesday that cannot be reconstructed by any combination of nostalgia and historical research. Number 6. The family GP who prescribed from personal knowledge rather than protocol. The GP of the early 1970s who had known a patient for 10 years prescribed for that patient's specific circumstances rather than for the demographic profile that the clinical guideline associated with their presenting symptoms. He knew that this particular patient would comply with a complex regime and that one would not, and he adjusted his clinical approach accordingly. The constraint of the protocol system has produced more consistent practice and eliminated some of the most harmful individual variations. It has also produced less individually responsive care, and the patients who experienced both forms of practice can describe the difference in ways that the clinical statistics do not fully capture. Number 5. The expectation of lifelong neighborhood. The working-class European family of the early 1970s was, by and large, geographically stable. The parents had grown up in the same neighborhood as their own parents. Their children attended the school the parents had attended. The grandparents were a 10-minute walk away, and the social infrastructure of mutual support, shared childcare, borrowed tools, neighbor expertise, and community knowledge was the product of decades of proximity and familiarity. When economic restructuring, housing costs, and the labor market requirement for geographical mobility disrupted this neighborhood permanence, the social infrastructure that had made the single-income household economically viable disappeared as a consequence. Number 4. The television that showed 2 channels and turned off at midnight. The television that the working-class European family sat around in the early 1970s was a single set in a single room that showed 2 or 3 channels whose programming ended between 11 and midnight. The family that watched television in the 1970s watched it together, watched the same things at the same time, and then stopped watching and went to bed. The social conversation of the following morning, at work, in the playground, in the shop, was a conversation about the same programs because everyone had seen the same things. The fragmentation of the broadcast landscape through cable, satellite, and streaming has replaced this shared cultural experience with an individually curated media environment in which no 2 households necessarily watch the same things at the same time. Number 3. The assumption that the post would arrive every morning before 8. The reliable single morning delivery that was universal throughout the 1970s created an expectation that written communications would be received within 24 hours of posting, and that the morning would bring a regular delivery of information, bills, and letters that required action. The reliability of the post was the communication infrastructure on which the working-class household's administrative life depended, and its decline through the 1980s and 1990s, before email had arrived to replace it, created a communication gap that nobody had anticipated. Number 2. The assumption that things could be repaired. The washing machine that broke down in 1974 was not assessed for its repairability. Its repairability was assumed. The repairman was called, the part was ordered, and the machine was returned to service because replacing it was a significant financial undertaking that the household was not prepared to make unless the repair was impossible or uneconomic. When the price of consumer goods fell to the point where repair costs exceeded replacement costs for most categories of goods, the culture of repairability collapsed within a decade, taking with it the repair trades, the specific skills, and the relationship with objects that assumed they were worth maintaining. Number 1. The assumption that next year would be more or less the same as this year. At the very top of this list, above the seatbeltless car and the smoking pub and the house-visiting GP and all the rest, sits the deepest and most pervasive normality of the 1970s working-class European household, the assumption that the social and economic arrangements of the present were broadly stable, and that the future would be a recognizable extension of the present rather than a disruption of it. The working-class family in Britain in 1974 expected that the employer would still be there, the mortgage would be manageable, the GP would be the same man, the street would be the same street, and the general shape of the life being lived would persist into the years ahead with gradual rather than radical change. This expectation was already being undermined by the economic crises of 1973 and 1974, the oil shock, the 3-day week, the inflation that would reach 25% in 1975, but it persisted as a cultural assumption even as the economic ground shifted beneath it, because it was the assumption of people who had lived through the post-war decades of gradual improvement and who had no framework for expecting the restructuring that was coming. When the restructuring arrived through the 1980s and the stability was revealed to have been contingent rather than permanent, the assumption died, and the generation that had lived inside it was left without the psychological framework for understanding a world in which next year was genuinely unpredictable. Your parents and grandparents lived inside that assumption for the whole of the 1970s. They did not know it was an assumption. They called it normal, and in the ways that mattered most, they were right. The knowledge is still here. They knew, now you know too.